The story is told of a New Year's Eve party that was held in northern England that was attended by some of England's celebrities. And among the celebrities that evening was a man called Thomas Carlyle. He was the famous 19th century Scottish historian, once considered probably the greatest social philosopher in Victorian England. And he was rather bored that evening, he tells us, with the idle chatter of the evening, and he decided to go for a walk down to the seashore. A storm was raging. He saw the breakers, the flashes of lightning splitting the heavens. He heard the response of the thunder as it rolled around where he was. And Carlyle tells us that he was sort of caught up in the bigness of it all. And he cried out, "I stand at the centre of immensities, at the conflux of eternities." And my dear friends, this morning I want to remind us all in this church that today that's exactly where you and I are standing. There are many signs in today's world of an approaching crisis. Think of some of these. The ever-escalating violence and fear that's stalking the world. The breakdown of family values, the breakdown of law and order. The immorality that is flaunted on TV screens. And young people, since you don't have the perspective of age, I guess I can say it has not always been as bad as it is today. The renewed calls of unity with Rome. I remember seeing the Pope, both the present Pope and the previous Pope, calling for the world to uphold Sunday as a day of rest. And he's now urging the governments of the world to legislate that this should be. I hear the increasingly urgent calls for a new world order, for a global government, a global financial control, a global religion that will go with this. I think of the rise of spiritualism in all of its myriad forms that are flaunting on our TV sets today. I think of the fear of the future engendered by the financial crisis, and I don't think we're through that yet. And I remember reading in that wonderful book, Great Controversy, where the author spoke about the fact that as we approach the end of time, natural disasters, and she mentioned some, tsunamis, earthquakes, great fires. She said these will increase, and she uses two interesting words, that they would increase in intensity and frequency. How often are we seeing on our TV screens the worst storm, the worst fires, the worst tidal wave? Dear friends, don't let these just pass you by. They would increase in frequency and intensity as we approach the coming of the Lord. Indeed, today, dear friends, we stand on the verge of solemn events of great magnitude. But for the Christian, and I have good news, for the Christian, it's not as hopeless as it may appear. And I know that I'm speaking to the converted perhaps in saying that. But for Christians, they believe that above all the distractions of this world, God still sits enthroned. Do you believe that? I believe it. I believe it. And it's particularly from the pages of the prophetic word, and by that I'm referring to the prophecies in God's word. It's from them particularly we gain the assurance that God has his hand on human events. And that brings me great courage. How important is it that Christians should study and understand the prophecies of the Bible? I want you to turn, and I hope you brought your Bibles this morning and certainly bring them this afternoon, in the book of Peter, 2 Peter chapter 1. I want you to notice this, because in 2 Peter chapter 1, the Apostle Peter is referring to that time, and he's remembering this. He's remembering the time when he, with James and John, you remember, went up into the top of that mountain, and that night they saw Jesus transfigured before them, glorified. They'd never seen Jesus like this before. And to their amazement, they saw two men coming down and talking to Jesus. Can you tell me who the two men were? One was Moses, and who was the other? Elijah. And they saw these two men from Old Testament times talking with Jesus that night. And it made a deep impression both on what they saw and on what they heard. But then Peter says, even considering that experience of what we saw and heard, we have a more sure word of something. Pick it up in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 19. And so we have the prophetic word confirmed. Some translations say we have a more sure word of prophecy, which you do well to heed as a light that shines in a dark place until the day dawns and the morning star arises in your heart. A more sure word of prophecy, and that prophecy, let me just move it on, that prophecy is like a light that shines in a dark place. More sure. You know, dear friends, the darker this world becomes, the more we need a light. I remember very well when I attended a youth camp in South New Zealand some years ago. I was not attending as a young person, so it doesn't go back that far. But I was invited to speak to the young people of South New Zealand. And I remember that on a Sabbath afternoon, they thought it would be a great idea if we just went a little further away from the camp, where a river cut its way right through a mountain. And they decided that we would walk along this river, through the mountain to the other side. Now, it wasn't very far. It might have been only about 200, 250 metres. But we were urged to take a torch. And I remember we started along this river, and of course at the beginning it was quite light, but as we went further into the mountain it became quite dark. And there were slippery stones, and the water was running only up to about our ankles. And then, of course, from the top there were these stones that sort of came down because it had been cut by this river over a long period of time. And so we were struggling to get through, but we had our torches. But then the young people decided when we were halfway through that everybody should turn their torches off. And we should go the rest of the way without a torch, without a light. And I distinctly remember that experience, dear friends, even though that happened a long time ago. Because the darkness was so intense you could almost feel it. Maybe you've been in that sort of experience. And we were struggling on, you know, slipping on the stones and the rocks that were coming down from the top of the cavern. That was sometimes hitting our head. And we had to feel our way, and the pace of our walk slowed down considerably. What a difference a light is in a dark place. A light in a dark place. Can I ask you this morning and answer the question, why should we study prophecy? Why should you know what the prophecies of the Bible tell us? How important is it for a Christian to know the prophecies of God's Word? I was interested to look up the Encyclopedia of Bible Prophecy recently, and I discovered that there are 1,239 prophecies in the Old Testament and 578 prophecies in the New Testament. That's a total of 1,817 prophecies in Scripture. Maybe you didn't realise there were that many. And that's about 27% of the whole of the Bible. In other words, a little more than a quarter of the Bible is prophecy. There must be some reason as to why God has given us so much of His Word in terms of prophecy, predicting the future. I think, and I want to suggest to you this morning, two reasons. If you have your Bibles, go over to the book of Isaiah, the great gospel prophet, in Isaiah chapter 41. Because here's my first reason. Why is prophecy so important? Because it is interesting to me that God stakes Himself as the true God among all the gods of this world, because He's the only one who can predict the future. Now that says something important to me. That God is establishing Himself as the true God among all the confusion of today's world, because He's the only one that can predict the future. You and I can't do that. We might know, well, I'm going to do this tomorrow morning. But next year, well, I'm planning to do something on a particular date, and it may come to pass. But the further you go into the future, the more dark the future is. But God says, I'm the only one who can foretell the future. Read it in Scripture. Look at Isaiah chapter 41, and let's pick it up in verse 21. God is speaking here, and He says, present your case, says the Lord. Bring forth your strong reasons, he says, the King of Jacob, and he's talking to the false gods and the people who worship them. Let them bring forth and show us what will happen. Let them show the former things what they were, that we may consider them and know the latter end of them, or declare to us things to come. Show the things that are to come hereafter, that we may know that you are gods. Notice these words. Yes, do good or do evil, that we may be dismayed and see it together. And if you turn over a little further into Isaiah chapter 46 and look at verses 9 and 10, because here God says, remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will do all my pleasure. Notice those words, that God is establishing himself as the true God because he's the only one who can tell the end from the beginning. That's reason number one why prophecy is so important. But the second eye is connected to it. It's based upon the words of Jesus. In fact, Jesus said these words the night before he died, and he repeated them twice because he wanted to remind us how important they were. What were those words? It's found in John chapter 14, verse 29, and let me merely quote it. I have told you before it comes to pass, that when it comes to pass, you may believe. Why does Jesus give us prophecy? Not just to provide a crystal ball that we might know what's happening. There's a far more important reason, and that reason is I have told you things before they come to pass, that when they come to pass, it's our faith that God is concerned about, whether we believe. And God has given us predictions, future prophecies, that when we see them come to pass, it's going to do something for your faith. Tell me, my friends, is faith important for the Christian? Can I just remind you of two texts? In the book of Ephesians chapter 6, where the Apostle Paul is speaking about the Christian's armour that all of us need to put on as we fight the devil day by day. But the one piece of the armour that protects me from no matter which angle the darts from the devil come, the arrows of temptation. I don't whip off my helmet to stop the arrows come. Neither do I take the sandals off my feet to stop the arrows from coming. But there's one piece of armour that no matter which way the arrows come, I can hold it in my hand and protect myself. What's that piece of armour? The shield. And what's the shield? Faith. That's the one thing there that protects me from the devil, in that sense that no matter which angle they come from, the arrows will hit the shield. Important, the shield of faith. Now, the other text I would remind you of is in Romans chapter 1, verse 17. You know it all, where Paul introduces the epistle that he writes to the church in Rome with these words, quoting from the Old Testament, the just, the righteous shall live by faith. We live day by day as Christians by faith. And since Jesus has given us prophecy to help build up your faith, I believe it is so important that we see it that way. You know, in the Old Testament, there is one book of prophecy that stands out above all the rest for some very important reasons in terms of the prophetic word, and that's the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel. And I just want to underscore tonight, this morning, in introducing this very wonderful book, by reminding you of some things about the book of Daniel. So as we think this morning of God's prophetic word, for some reason this is not working. Prophetic insights for our day. Let's have a look at what makes this book so special. Number one is this, and I would expect that to be true. Here is a book that reveals Jesus. Now, you may not say, well, look, hold on, I'm not seeing too much of Jesus in that book. But let me remind you of this fact. In Daniel chapter 2, Jesus is that stone that smites the image on the feet and the toes. In Daniel chapter 3, he's the one who comes down in the furnace with the 3 young men. In Daniel chapter 7, Jesus is the Son of Man who comes to the judgment. In Daniel chapter 8, he's the Prince of Princes. In Daniel chapter 9, he's the Messiah, the Prince. In chapter 10, he's the angel in linen. Chapter 11, the Prince of the Covenant. In chapter 12, Michael, the great prince who stands for your people. A book that reveals Jesus. And we must never forget that. But then I'd like to remind you that also in this book, it's the only Old Testament book that Jesus mentions by name and encourages us to read it. Did you realize that? Now, don't misunderstand me. Jesus quoted from probably most of the books of the Bible. But in all the four Gospels, he only mentions the name of one book, and that's Daniel. And that's in the context of preparing for the second coming of Christ. Does anybody here this morning know what verse I'm referring to where Jesus makes mention of the book of Daniel? Matthew chapter 24. And Matthew chapter 24 is the chapter dealing with the second coming of Jesus. And he says, when you see the abomination of desolation that Daniel spoke about, make sure you're reading that book so that you can be prepared for the crises that lie ahead. Just before his second coming, in the context of the signs of the second coming, that's the book he mentions by name. And he never mentions another Old Testament book anywhere in the Gospels. But then look at this one. The book of Daniel is the only book that reveals in prophecy the very year of Jesus' baptism and his death, and it was written 500 years in advance. Just don't let that go over the top of your head this morning. It's like me making a prediction this morning of something that's going to happen in the year 2500. And yet here in this remarkable book, the very year of Jesus' baptism and his death are written. And that prophecy is so important that 2 weeks from this afternoon, I'll show you that prophecy again. Then number 4, it's the only book in all the Bible in which the author is told to close his book until a certain time. I'd like you to turn to Daniel this morning and look at Daniel chapter 12 and verse 4. Daniel chapter 12 and verse 4. In the last chapter of this wonderful book, what is Daniel told? But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Now, I just want you to look at the first part of that text. Did you realize how unique that verse is? That of all the 66 books of the Bible, the only author who is told, shut up your book, close it up, seal it up, in the book of Revelation. If you read the last chapter or so in the book of Revelation, it says, don't seal up your book. Don't close it up. And yet Daniel was told to close his book, seal it up. Why? I wonder why. The answer, I think, is found in this last point I want you to notice, because it's the only book in the Bible written especially for the time of the end. Did you realize that? The only book, 66 books in the Bible, and the only one that was written especially for the time of the end is the book of Daniel. Why do I say that? Because the text goes on to say, Daniel, close up your book, seal it up, seal up the words until the time of the end. Until the time of the end. That's suggesting to me, dear friends, that when the time of the end comes, the book of Daniel is to be opened with a special message for people living at that time. Now, that maybe leads me, and I'm not sure about this church since I haven't been here before. Can I just put a diagram on the screen to clarify this? Daniel's book was to be closed, sealed up, until the time of the end. There are two expressions that we need to just clarify for a moment. The time of the end and the end of time. What's the difference between those two? Can you tell me what is the end of time? What event happens at the end of time? The second coming of Jesus. And so the end of time is the second coming of Jesus. But the time of the end is not the same. The time of the end is a period of time preceding the second coming of Christ, leading up to the second coming of Christ. Do we know when the time of the end would begin? we do. And this suggests, and can you listen to me carefully, dear friends, if we know when the time of the end began, from that time onwards, the book of Daniel was especially to be studied and understood by the people of God. How do we know when the time of the end begins? We won't take time since it's against me this morning, but can I just put this on the screen and it will become clearer this afternoon? So you'll have to accept my word for this. The Bible in Daniel chapter 12, we've just read, seal up your book until the time of the end. If you read the verses that immediately follow that verse, the angel explains when the time of the end is going to come, and therefore that's when the book of Daniel is to be opened. So what is the time? He explains it that there is a prophetic period of time called a time, times, and dividing of time in the book of Daniel chapter 12. And we know, and I'll explain this afternoon why we know this, just please accept my word for it, that that period of time of 1,260 years, a time, times and half a time, began in 538 and 1798. Can those dates be established from Scripture? Yes, my friends, come back this afternoon and I'll show you how. But if that's the period that the angel explained, that's what's leading into the time of the end. We have been living in the time of the end since 1798. This is the time period leading up to the coming of Jesus. And that's the time when the book of Daniel was to be opened. Close up your book, the angel said, until the time of the end, which suggests that when the time of the end comes, the book of Daniel is to be opened up in a very remarkable way. Why is the book of Daniel to be opened in the time of the end? Can I just answer a question that maybe is going through your mind? Did that mean that nobody was to read the book of Daniel prior to 1798? Does that mean that nobody was to understand any portions of the book of Daniel before 1798? I'm sure that parents of children, both in Old Testament times and in New Testament times, have told their children the story of Daniel in the lion's den that Heidi reminded us of, the children of this morning. And what about those 3 young men in the fiery furnace? Stories that have been told to children and to older people for centuries. And in fact, even the words of Jesus that I quoted before in Matthew 24, where he spoke to his disciples, when you see the abomination of desolation that Daniel spoke about, and he was referring there to the armies of Rome that would surround the city of Jerusalem and destroy it. And can anybody tell me this morning what year was Jerusalem destroyed? AD 70. Yeah, in the 1st century. So Jesus is telling his disciples, read the book of Daniel where it speaks about the abomination of desolation, because when you see that happening in Jerusalem, in the holy place, you know that the city is about to be destroyed. So he wanted his people to read the book of Daniel in the 1st century. What then does it mean that the book of Daniel was to be sealed up, closed, until the time of the end? Listen to my answer, dear friends, and it'll come clearer as we go through. The themes and the stories of that book and the message every chapter contains was to have special meaning, significance, and relevance for God's people living in the time of the end. Did you realize that? Let me explain why. The book of Daniel has often been called a tale of 2 cities. Can anybody suggest to me this morning what 2 cities do you think those are? What 2 cities loom large in the book of Daniel? And I'm referring to not only the 2 cities, but the people who were inhabitants of those 2 cities and the God of those 2 cities. What's one of them? I think I heard it mentioned. Babylon. Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar, living in the 600s and the 500s BC. What's the other city that you think would loom large? Jerusalem. Jerusalem. And did you realize this about the book of Daniel? That in every one of the chapters, in the first 6 chapters, which deal with the history, And then you turn to the prophetic parts of the Bible, that's 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, and 12, where it outlines 3 prophetic outlines. In every one of those, there's a conflict between Babylon and Jerusalem, and the people of Babylon and the people of Jerusalem. And in every one of them, Babylon goes down, and the people of Jerusalem and the God of Jerusalem goes up. That's in every part of the book of Daniel. And I want you to notice Daniel 1. How does the book of Daniel begin? Don't miss the significance of the first 2 verses. Turn over to Daniel chapter 1. What do we read of here? This appears to be just a dry historical account. But believe me, my friends, it's not. And why do I say that? Because as you read the Bible, you'll often find that the first couple of verses or the first chapter in the Bible outlines the theme of the whole of that book. In Romans, the just shall live by faith, and the rest of Romans is unpacking how we're to live by faith. Genesis 1 verse 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and the rest of the book of Genesis unfolds the beginnings of so many things. What do we read of in Daniel? Look at verses 1 and 2. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Why are those 2 verses so important? Let me tell you. Here is the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, you know his name. He comes across to Jerusalem and he surrounds it, lays a siege against the city. Finally, he breaks through into the city itself, and he particularly attacks what? The temple, Solomon's temple. As we think about these 2 cities with Babylon and Jerusalem, that glorious temple that Solomon had built with its holy place and most holy place, the sanctuary we sometimes refer to, don't miss, that's not an insignificant detail. Because here's the king of Babylon coming to Jerusalem, and what's he do? He goes right into that magnificent temple, and ultimately, just a few years later, even destroys Solomon's temple. A terrible disaster for the people of God. A magnificent temple. But why is that so significant? Can I remind us all this morning, dear friends, that it was in that temple where the whole of the plan of salvation was laid before the Jewish people and the world. That was where they offered their sacrifices. That was where God's plan to save people from sin by offering an innocent little lamb or an animal, and the blood cleansed them from sin. Echoes of the gospel. Hear the law of God that God had written with his own finger in tables of stone. That was right in the ark, in the most holy place of that temple. All the services of that temple pointed to Christ as a lamb, as a priest, as an intercessor, as a judge. And the king of Babylon comes and destroys it. Maybe you'll realize this, my friends, near as we unpack this a little more this afternoon and later on. But do you realize that both Babylon and Jerusalem had 2 kings? And while time is against me, may I remind you that in the book of Isaiah chapter 14, it clearly identifies the king of Babylon as Satan. Don't miss the significance of that. Satan, the one who has opposed the work and the plans of God from the very beginnings, he is described there in Isaiah 14 as the king of Babylon. But the city of Jerusalem also has a king. And you'll find it described there in Psalm 48 verses 1 and 2 that Jehovah, and that's Jesus in the Old Testament, is the king of Jerusalem. And since this conflict of Babylon versus Jerusalem, introduced in the first few verses and followed right through the whole of the book of Daniel, we can see it as a playing out of the great controversy. The king of Babylon, Satan. The king of Jerusalem, Jesus. And that's why in every one of the chapters of the book of Daniel, there's a conflict between Babylon and Jerusalem. And those areas of conflict will have special relevance to the people living in the time of the end. I don't need to remind you this morning, dear friends, that as we think of the book of the plan of Jerusalem, that there you'll see up there on the northern part of there is Mount Zion. And if you go to Jerusalem today, that's Mount Zion there, but up here is Mount Moriah. And it's on Mount Moriah where Abraham offered his son Isaac. And it's on Mount Moriah where the Solomon's temple was built. And it's on Mount Moriah that the Arab mosque in Jerusalem is built, right on that place. But it's a significant place in the plans and purposes of God. The book of Daniel, or the book of Revelation, and the book of Genesis. You remember the origin of Babylon? You go back to the Tower of what? And what does the word Babel mean? Confusion. Now that's when, as they built that huge tower, and don't miss the significance of the Tower of Babel, because it was an attempt for men to save themselves. Why do I say that? Because they built that tower even though they knew that Jesus, or God, had said to them, I'll never again destroy the world with a flood. We're told that they built that tower by their own labour to save themselves, to avoid the flood, because they didn't believe in God. And that describes the very essence of the book of Babel and Babylon. A defiance against God, unbelief, salvation by works, people trying to save themselves, as opposed to Jerusalem and salvation by faith and a dependence upon God. Jerusalem, with the temple right at the top, that's an artist's picture of what Jerusalem must have looked like in the days before its destruction, with the temple right at the very top, on the top mountain there, Mount Moriah, the city of Jerusalem. And the book of Revelation, of course, describes at the end of the Bible, New Jerusalem coming down from heaven. Do you remember that? Surrounded by the forces of wickedness and evil, and it describes them as Gog and Magog. It's significant that Gog and Magog is a cryptic, hidden name for Babylon. And so at the very end of the Bible, you've got Babylon and the forces of spiritual Babylon surrounding the city of Jerusalem as it comes down from God out of heaven. Tell me, or just listen to this point. Is Babylon to become significant for God's people living in the time of the end? I see some of you nodding your head. Can you tell me why? In other words, what I'm trying to remind you of this morning as we introduce this theme of this book is that Babylon existed back in the 600s and the 500s with its king Nebuchadnezzar. But when it collapsed in 539 BC to be replaced by Medo-Persia, you remember the Second Kingdom? Was that the end of Babylon? No, my friends. And that's why this book speaks to God's people in the time of the end. I'm speaking to a group of people this morning, I assume, who are largely Seventh-day Adventists. And Seventh-day Adventists believe that we have to take to the world three angels' messages. God's last message of warning to go to the world. Can you recall for me this morning what the second of those three angels is to say to the world? I think you need to read it. Didn't get a very solid answer. Would you go over to Revelation chapter 14? And I want you to notice verse 8. Revelation 14, verse 8. This is the second part of God's last message to the world. This is the message, can I remind us all this morning, that is the reason for the existence of this church. To proclaim God's last appeal to a world that is fast falling in opposition to God. And what's the second part of that message say? Read it in Revelation 14, verse 8. And another angel followed, saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Do you understand why it's to be part of God's last message to announce the fall of Babylon? I thought Babylon fell in 539 BC, 2,500 years ago. If Babylon collapsed back there, why does God say in the last message I'm going to say to the world through my people who are living in the time of the end, why do they announce the fall of Babylon? Because in the book of Revelation, ancient Babylon becomes worldwide spiritual Babylon at the end of time. And that's why this book is to be opened up in the time of the end, because its issues and its stories are to have special reference and relevance to the people of God living in the time of the end. Why do I say that? Very quickly review, because time is running away. Do you remember in Revelation we have two women? One woman is a beautiful woman. She's described in Revelation 12 as being clothed with the sun. She's standing on the moon. She has a crown of 12 stars on her head. And she's pregnant, because the Bible says in Revelation 12 she's about to give birth to a baby boy, and that baby boy is recognized and called the Messiah, Jesus. And so here is this one beautiful woman in the mentioned here. And the Old Testament tells me that God compares or likens the daughter of Zion to a comely and delicate woman. The daughter of Zion, Mount Zion, where Jerusalem is. So this woman here represents, as we have said, and I believe for very good reason, but no time to mention the text, this woman in Revelation 12 represents the people of Zion, God's people, spiritual Israel, the church. And this woman here is described as waiting for the birth of Jesus. And then the rest of that chapter describes how the woman is going to be attacked by Satan, and God is going to lead the woman into the wilderness, where she's going to be in the wilderness for 1,260 years. The same period of time that's mentioned for introducing the time of the end. This beautiful woman, but she's not the only woman in Revelation. If you turn over to Revelation 17 in your Bible, if it's a long time since you've read it, there's another woman. Very strong contrast. Because whereas the other woman represents Jerusalem, if you like, God's people, Mount Zion, this woman has a name on her forehead. She's described as a harlot, a prostitute. The other woman is clothed with the sun, a heavenly symbol representing the church, clothed with the righteousness of Jesus. This woman is decked with everything man-made, not the sun standing on the moon with a crown of stars. This woman is purple and scarlet and gold and precious stones and pearls. She's a prostitute. She has in her hand a golden cup, and with the golden cup, the Bible says, she would make all the nations in the time of the end drunk with her doctrines. And the interesting thing to me, dear friends, is that that woman has a name on her forehead. And what's the name? Babylon the Great. Babylon. Can you understand why that second angel's message is going to announce to the world that Babylon is fallen? That just as that first woman represents as God, pure church, the Bible predicts that in the last days there's going to develop a global church. Listen to my words. A global religious movement of confusion, Babylon. And that's going to grab the attention of the kings of the world. In fact, it describes this woman as having committed adultery with the kings of the earth. A state-church union. And that is fast developing today, may I remind you, my friends. And that's why God is sending a message about the fall of Babylon. But if you turn over to Revelation 18, it says, I heard a voice from heaven saying, come out of Babylon, my people. God would have his people still in Babylon. But in the time of the end, he's going to send a message to call God's people to respond and come out of Babylon, my people. Another angel followed, saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she has made all the nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins and you receive of her plagues." Oh, my friends, these are important messages, vital messages to the salvation of the world. And it's set in the city of Babylon, a glorious city, a golden city. We'll talk more about this afternoon. But it's in this city where so many of the issues that concern God's people take place. Can I, before I close this morning, remind you of something that I think is important? I mentioned before that in every one of the 6 chapters, the historical chapters of Daniel, it represents a conflict between the people of Babylon and the people of Jerusalem, the God of Jerusalem and the gods of Babylon. And in every chapter, God's people come up to the top like a cork, and Babylon and its people go down. Listen to this before I close. In chapter 1, there's that interesting conflict between the diet, listen to the word I'm using, of Babylon, and the diet of Jerusalem. And it's very easy to read the book of Daniel and say, why should God, in recording the book of Daniel chapter 1, talk about an issue over diet? This is not me speaking, dear friends, it's in Daniel 1. They refused the wine on the king's table. They chose, it says, vegetables to eat and water to drink. And there's a conflict between the diet of Babylon that the king provided and the diet of Jerusalem. Which one goes down and which one comes up? At the end of chapter 1, Daniel and his friends are found 10 times wiser than all those who looked at the diet of Babylon, an issue that's to come in the time of the end when spiritual Babylon rules the world. Daniel 2, a conflict between the wisdom of Babylon, the wise men. The king says, "Tell me the dream I've dreamed." But he'd forgotten. And they were hopeless. Their wisdom failed, representing their contact with the gods of Babylon. And then comes a young man called Daniel, and he says, "I'll pray to the God of Jerusalem, and he will give me the vision." And there's the conflict between the wisdom of Babylon and the wisdom of Jerusalem. And which one goes down and which one comes up? At the end of chapter 2, Daniel and his friends are elevated to be in charge of the province of Babylon, and the wise men fail. Daniel 3, the conflict over worship. That's the story of the 3 young men facing the fiery furnace. Who goes down? They worship in chapter 3. The worship of Babylon fails, and the worship of God, the God of Jerusalem, succeeds. And even though thrown into a burning hot fiery furnace, think of the impossibility of this scene that we've known about throughout our childhood. A furnace heated 7 times hotter, and they are thrown in, and the men who throw them in die at the heat of the flames, and here they are walking around. And Jesus himself comes to talk with them. Who wins? Who is vindicated? Daniel chapter 4, the spirit of Babylon and Jerusalem, the story of Nebuchadnezzar and his madness. Daniel chapter 5, the conflict over the gods of Babylon and the God of Jerusalem, and Belshazzar seeing the writing on the wall. And who wins at the end of that chapter? Daniel is elevated to be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. Daniel chapter 6, the lion's den chapter, the laws of men versus the laws of God. And who wins as Daniel is taken out of that den? Oh, my friends, remember in each chapter, we see the representatives and the principles of God's people victorious. Is that a message for God's people in the time of the end? When spiritual Babylon is going to be ruling the world, do you and I need to have our faith confirmed that even though it's hard to hold on to faith, Jerusalem is going to win out at the end? And that's the message for the time of the end that God would bring to each one of us. I hope that in sharing these words to you this morning, dear friends, that it might whet your appetite to look at these great prophetic outlines that we're going to look at this afternoon in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel 8 next week, Daniel 9, because it will confirm your faith, draw you nearer to Jesus, which is so important, and be prepared to stand like those three young worthies, loyal to God, faithful to him, though the world might be compelling us to do something else. That can only happen as a result of our relationship with Jesus. May the Lord bless us.